The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling across the principal's office and into every corner of the school that morning. And for a split-second time itself seemed to hesitate, as if waiting to see who would break first. The janitor stood near the door with his cap twisted in his hands, the smell of bleach still clinging to his clothes, while the principal stared at a worn student file and then back at the man before her voice barely steady as she asked if the troubled boy whose records lay open on her desk was his son. In that instant, the air grew heavy with everything unsaid, and it was impossible not to wonder what you would do if a life you had carefully hidden suddenly stood exposed in the brightest light. The school sat in a quiet town in Ohio, one of those places where brick buildings and American flags made people feel safe even when they were not, and where everyone knew the janitor as Thomas Walker, the quiet man who came in before dawn and left long after the last bell. He scrubbed floors, fixed leaky sinks, and emptied trash cans without ever drawing attention to himself, and most days people barely noticed him beyond a polite nod. Few knew that Thomas once had dreams of becoming an engineer, that he had dropped out of college after his wife Ruth fell ill, or that he spent years juggling night shifts and exhaustion just to keep food on the table. Life had narrowed his world into long hallways and flickering fluorescent lights, and somewhere along the way he had learned that being invisible hurt less than hoping. The boy in the file was named Caleb Walker, a sophomore with slipping grades, frequent absences, and a temper that seemed to ignite without warning. Teachers saw him as another problem waiting to explode, a kid already halfway out the door of his future, and the principal, Margaret Collins, had called Thomas in only because school policy demanded parental involvement before suspension. As she studied the matching last name, a memory stirred of seeing Thomas lingering by the lockers some afternoons, pretending to fix a dent or wipe a smudge while watching a tall, restless boy from a distance. What if this were your child, struggling in silence while you stood close enough to help yet too afraid to reach out? What if pride, fear, or shame built a wall higher than love? Thomas felt his chest tighten as the truth pressed against his ribs, and years of carefully buried guilt rose like floodwater. Caleb had been just 6 when Ruth died. His small hands clutching Thomas's sleeve at the hospital as machines fell silent, and the world changed forever. Grief had turned Thomas inward, and survival had demanded every ounce of his energy, leaving little room for bedtime stories or long talks. As Caleb grew, the distance between them widened, not from lack of love, but from exhaustion and unspoken sorrow, and by the time Thomas took the janitor job at the same school his son attended, it felt easier to remain hidden than to risk rejection. He told himself that staying out of the way was protecting Caleb from embarrassment, never admitting that he was also protecting himself from the pain of being seen as a failure. Margaret watched Thomas struggle to find words, and something in his silence softened her stern resolve. She had spent years enforcing rules, convinced structure saved children, yet she could not ignore the trembling in the man's hands or the quiet dignity in his posture. She thought of her own teenage years, the mistakes she barely escaped, and the adults who had chosen compassion over punishment. Caleb's record spoke of anger and confusion, but it also showed flashes of brilliance in math and moments of kindness that rarely lasted. The principal realized that behind every line of discipline was a story waiting to be understood, and she wondered how many chances she herself had overlooked in the name of order. When Thomas finally nodded, admitting the truth without words, the room seemed to exhale. He spoke of long nights working 2 jobs, of coming home too tired to notice his son slipping away, and of standing in hallways mopping floors while listening to Caleb laugh with friends, too afraid to interrupt a life that no longer seemed to include him. He did not ask for mercy, only for the chance to try again, and that humility cut deeper than any excuse ever could. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes as she imagined the weight of loving someone from afar, and she knew that sending Caleb home with a suspension would only deepen the wound already carved into both their hearts. The school chose a different path that day, one that rippled outward in ways no policy manual could predict. Instead of punishment, Caleb was offered counseling, tutoring, and a place in an after-school program, and Thomas was encouraged to be present not as a janitor, but as a father. The first afternoon Thomas waited in the library, his hands shaking as Caleb walked in and stopped short at the sight of him, confusion and anger flashing across his face. There were no dramatic speeches, no sudden forgiveness, only the fragile beginning of honesty, and that was enough. Over time, awkward conversations turned into shared meals, missed assignments became late-night study sessions, and resentment slowly made room for understanding. Weeks passed, and teachers began to notice subtle changes, a raised hand here, a completed project there, small victories that hinted at something deeper shifting inside the boy. Thomas still cleaned floors, but he did so with his head held higher, aware now that his presence mattered beyond the shine of the tiles. Margaret watched from her office window as father and son walked to the parking lot together one evening, their silhouettes framed by the setting sun, and she felt a quiet gratitude for the reminder that leadership sometimes meant stepping back and letting grace do the work. The school, too, seemed changed, as if kindness had seeped into its walls and softened the edges of every rule. Years later, Caleb would graduate with honors, his path leading him toward the engineering degree his father once abandoned, and Thomas would sit in the audience wiping tears he no longer felt ashamed to shed. The question that once froze him in place had become the turning point that saved them both, proof that secrets, when brought into the light, could heal rather than destroy. Just before this story ends, take a moment to reflect and share in the comments what you would have done if you were standing in Thomas's place, holding a truth that could change everything. As the final applause faded and life moved forward, the lesson lingered like a quiet prayer, reminding everyone who heard it that second chances often arrive disguised as uncomfortable questions, and that love, when finally spoken, has the power to rewrite even the most painful chapters. If this story truly touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe so more people can be reminded that compassion can change lives in ways rules never could.